everybody, it's Nina. Thanks for joining me today. As you know, school has begun for a lot of you, and I know that teacher gifts are something that everybody likes to give to some of their favorite teachers. I'm going to show you how to create an apple jar, and this is perfect for using to create for teachers to give as gifts. And they're really fun. You can fill them with all sorts of fun things, such as little treats, candies, that kind of stuff. And then I'll also show you how to make a cute little card to go with it so that you have a gift set. For the jar itself, we'll be using some distress oxide inks as well as chalk paint, and I'll show you how easy it is to be able to get a really fun distressed look on the jar. We'll be using a lot of Tim Holtz products today in this video. So I hope you'll join me in learning a little bit more about creating some fun teacher gifts and also see some fun techniques in action. Let's get started. Okay, so the jar you see here is from Tim Holtz, and I've got some chalk paint here that I'm going to be using to paint the jar. I got the chalk paint at a local hardware store. You can use any type of chalk paint you'd like. Just keep in mind to use an opaque chalk paint instead of translucent, or the jar will be a lot more translucent than the finished project that you saw that I created. So I'm going to go ahead and start painting my jars using some sponge brushes. The reason I chose the sponge brush was because that was what I had on hand and I didn't want to ruin any of my good brushes. So this is the reason why I chose the sponge brush. So any types of brushes that you want to go ahead and use for this, it doesn't really matter. I'm painting the jar with the red paint first, and I'm going to need to put multiple coats on this jar simply because it's glass. As you can see here, as I'm applying the paint down onto the jar, you get some streaks and it's not completely opaque. So after I've added the first coat, I'll need to go back in with multiple coats. The chalk paint didn't take very long to dry. I didn't put a very thick coat on top for each layer, so it only took probably about an hour for each coat to fully dry. Between coats, I worked on other things. After I applied the first coat, I went ahead and started working on creating the leaves. For the leaves, I wanted them to be made with some wood paper because I wanted to have the texture of the wood to kind of coordinate with the look of the apple jar. The apple jar has a very distressed look to it, and that's because I wanted to use some distressed products to give it a really fun textural feel. So the wood paper, like I said, worked great in coordinating with the jar and the feel of the project. So I'm taking the wood paper, which is some birch color paper, and I'm adding the green paint over top, and I only used one layer of paint so that way I could get some of that texture of the wood to show through. Moving on to my jar again, I'm putting another coat of red paint on top. This is the second coat, and as I'm applying the paint down, I'm making sure to work in downward motions, up and down motions, so that way I get an even grain across the entire jar. If you apply it in different directions, you're going to see that after it's dried. So just make sure to go in the same direction as you paint, so that way you have a really smooth coverage on top of the jar. At this point, I had already finished the third layer of paint, so now I'm flipping the jar over and painting the bottom layer. And the bottom I'm going to go ahead and paint with 3 coats as well. After I've painted the entire jar, it's time to add some distressing. Now you could go ahead and skip this step and leave it as is, but I wanted to give it that distressed feel. So I'm going to go ahead and take some distress oxide ink and add this in what I'm calling the highlights of the apple. If you look at an apple, apples have some really interesting texture to them. And I wanted to mimic that with the distress oxide ink because I knew it would give kind of a whitish halo on top of the jar. And that creates a really fun textural feel. It gives it kind of a vintage look, and it also gives it that apple texture. So I went ahead and added that onto the jar. You could also use darker colors, but I wanted to use something a little bit on the brighter side. After my jar was finished, I'm taking some leaves from the poinsettia stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. These are the coordinating dies. And the reason I chose this was because I liked the shape of the leaf. So kind of look around at your supplies and see how you can use stamps or dies that were from a totally different theme and use them to create the look you're going for. I die cut those leaves from that wood paper on the front and the back side so that I could get a mirror image of the leaf, and then I'll adhere the 2 pieces together. This gives me a sturdier leaf, and it also allows the green to be on both sides, so that way no matter what angle you look at, you always see a green leaf. I used some distress oxide ink along the edges just to give the leaf a little bit of interest and depth and also hide the core of the paper. For the lid of the jar, I wanted that to be brown because I thought that would match with the green and the red on the jar perfectly. And of course, green and red mixed together make brown, so I don't need a third color of paint. I can just go ahead and mix those 2 colors together until I get the shade of brown that I want. After I've mixed those paints together, I'm mixing them onto an Art Impressions palette. This cleans off so easily. I'm going to start painting this onto my lid. Now, as I did this, I needed to again put multiple layers of the paint onto the lid so that I get a nice even coverage. I did a total of 3 layers, and in between each layer, I actually dried it with my heat gun to help speed up the process of the drying, and also because the tin of the lid could take the heat. So I added a second coat, and this time I'm going perpendicular to the direction that I had gone to previously. So when I went side to side on the first layer, I went up and down on the second layer so that I got a nice smooth coverage. Once my lid was completely dried, I need to create a hole to put my screw into so that I could put the handle on top. You don't need to put a handle, but the handle is going to act as the stem of the apple. So I want this to look as realistic as an apple as I can. So by adding the handle on top, that creates the realistic appearance. I'm going to add the screw into the hole that I created with my craft pick. And because the lid isn't super thick, the craft pick created the hole really easily. If your lid is a little bit thicker, you might want to use a drill. So here I'm going to go ahead and put my handle onto the screw that I've already applied into the lid. Just screw that on, and then I'll be able to attach the leaves underneath of the lid. I tucked them underneath and then added just a little bit of glue on the back side to help hold them in place. This again creates that really fun, realistic appearance of having a stem on top of the apple with the leaves. After I had painted all of these pieces, I did add a clear coat over top as a sealer so that way the paint wouldn't chip. Because the chalk paint on these surfaces isn't meant to be perfectly smooth, you will get some chipping. If you want something that's not going to chip, you're going to want to use a paint that's meant for glass. So after you've done all of your painting, you're going to want to go ahead and add a sealer on top of all of this. You can use either a wax sealer or a paint sealer, and you'll want something that's going to dry matte. So after I painted my jar and had built it completely, I need to create a card to match with it. So I'm going to use some products from Simon Says Stamp and also some distress inks. I'll do some watercoloring with the distress inks and create a really fun background. So I've got my watercolor paper here, and I'm using the Dancing Fruits stamp set and also this great Thank You Teacher sentiment set. The Thank You Teacher sentiment set is a newer stamp set. We released this just a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to use that for the sentiment on my card. I'm stamping the apple from Dancing Fruit all over this piece of watercolor paper to create a background, and then I'm going to use some Distress Oxide inks in Candied Apple, Fired Brick, and Aged Mahogany to paint in each of the apples. I stamped the apples with some Your Next Stamp black ink, and I'm going to go ahead and paint these in a watercolor look. I'm dropping the color onto the little apples in random fashions. Each apple is going to be colored completely different simply because I wanted to have some variation in the background. As I'm applying the paint, I'm letting the water move the color. So as you can see here, I apply a wet color and then I layer more wet color on top of that and continue doing that until I fill in the entire apple. And because all of these paints had a lot of water to them, that's moving the color and letting them blend into each other really nicely. For the leaves, I used bundled sage and peeled paint, and that creates a really nice toned green, matches the green on my apple jar perfectly. And then of course I need to color in the stems, so I used some brush corduroy and I just dropped some of that color towards the bottom of the stem and then went ahead and blended that out with my brush and a little bit of water. For the background, I'm using some scattered straw ink and I'm going around the apples to create a background color. Now I'm being careful not to get too close to the apples. There's going to be a white border around each of the apples, but I think that helps add to the really cute feel of the card, and it also gives the apples a chance to kind of pop. And the reason I'm not going too close is because I don't want the colors to blend and mix together. So I added some water splatters and some splatters of red ink onto the panel. Then I cut it out with a wonky stitched rectangle die. The sentiment I'm going to put in the bottom corner, and I'm going to stamp this in some Simon Says Stamp clear ink. I need to prep the surface though first, just to make sure I get rid of all that extra moisture and wetness that might attract more embossing powder. I'll ink up the stamp and press it down really well, and then I'll add a little bit of white embossing powder on top. Now you're going to notice that the white embossing powder does not show up all that well, and I knew it wasn't going to do that. And the reason I was choosing to use the white is because I thought I'm going to add some color behind this in some pumice stone. Now this is something that could easily go wrong very quickly, but I had this idea that I wanted to have some strokes in the background behind the sentiment to help pop it up, and I was like, well, let's go for it. I could totally mess this up and have to redo it completely, but let's try it. And I loved how it turned out. So my idea ended up working out, so don't feel afraid of trying new things like this. This looked really cool, and I loved how it turned out and how that pumice stone really warms up the card. So I added some splatters of the pumice stone, and you can see how that sentiment just pops now with that pumice stone brushed behind the sentiment. So I hope you enjoyed this video and got some inspiration on creating some teacher gifts. You could totally do either one or the other, so I hope you got some inspiration either way. And thank you so much for stopping by and spending some time with me. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more inspiration. I'll see you again very soon. Bye!